Hi, welcome to this presentation in the ALAC Speakers Forum. ALAC stands for the Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking, and I am Donna Warren at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. It is my honor to welcome to the platform today Lee McIntyre, who is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, who is here to talk to us about disinformation, denialism, and the assault on truth. So I take it away, Professor McIntyre.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. It's my pleasure to be here. So I just wrote a book called On Disinformation, and the title of my talk, actually, the title I've got here is Stump Speech for On Disinformation. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. During the pandemic, I wrote a book about how to talk to science deniers. It troubled me that some people believe false things and that they won't be convinced by facts about evolution, about climate change, about vaccines, even about the shape of the earth. And so I wondered what to do. As it turned out, the key issue behind all of this was trust. If a science denier doesn't know you, it means that they probably don't trust you either, which makes facts meaningless. So my solution was to find science deniers and go out and talk to them face to face, not just about what they believed, but why they believed it, because I thought that that might be a way to build some trust. Now, this is a lot harder than just amassing a bunch of facts, dumping it on people, and then walking away if they won't listen. But it's also the only method that has any hope of success. If you yell at someone or you insult them, they just close down. If you open up and engage with them, you have a chance. Now, this doesn't always work, and to tell you the truth, it doesn't even usually work. But if you read the literature about how it is that some science deniers do eventually change their minds, you'll notice that it always happens in exactly the same way. They finally hear the evidence from someone who took the time to talk with them calmly and patiently and respectfully. And I think that that's because science denial is not really about facts at all. It's about identity and values and community. So the slogan that I use is science deniers don't have an information deficit, they have a trust deficit. But as I was writing my book, I noticed that out there in pandemic world, the problem just seemed to be getting worse. Worse yet, science denial seemed to be metastasizing into reality denial. Trump's big lie about the 2020 election, the January 6th insurrection. All of a sudden, it seemed like we weren't just polarized about a few topics in science, but we were polarized about reality itself, which for a group of philosophers should be pretty concerning. Why was this happening? A few years back, there was a breakthrough discovery about how science deniers reason based on some work by Mark and Chris Hufnagel. It was later developed by cognitive scientists John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski. And what they found is that all science deniers reason in exactly the same way. They cherry pick evidence. They believe in conspiracy theories. They rely on fake experts. They engage in illogical reasoning. I know that one's going to hit home with you. And they think that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. Now, those 5 steps are really both necessary and sufficient for being a science denier. You find them in every facet of science denial you can think of. And it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because it explains why people began freaking out about the COVID vaccines and buying into all sorts of conspiracy theories about the FDA and the CDC, why they believed all those cranks on the internet, but they demonized Dr. Fauci. It also explains why one unverified report of somebody reacting to a vaccine was enough to counterbalance all of the successful inoculations that had taken place. And then I realized that this is what was also happening in the lies that Trump was telling about the 2020 election. Wild conspiracy theories about bamboo ballots in Arizona and Italian satellites that were changing votes. Reliance on an untested partisan polling firm to do the Arizona recounts, and claims that there was no violence on January 6th, right alongside the excuse that all the violence on January 6th was committed by Antifa. I mean, how can those two things possibly be true at the same time? It's one or the other. And that's the exact same blueprint that the science deniers were following. They provided the roadmap. So now I thought we're in real trouble, not just because the problems of the pandemic had spread into an infodemic, but because even if my go out and talk to them solution worked, we couldn't get enough people out there fast enough to get ahead of the problem. The analogy of the pandemic was constantly on my mind. Rather than just trying to heal the sick during an infodemic, wasn't there some way to keep them from getting sick from bad information in the first place? Sometimes another slogan I come up with is, you can't debunk your way out of an infodemic. It's just, it's impossible to do. What was behind all this, and why did the problem seem to keep growing? I finally accepted the idea that you can't debunk your way out of an infodemic. Instead, you have to think about where all of the falsehood is coming from. Not just why people believe it, but who's producing it. So again, it's not just what they believe, and it's not even why they believe it. It's who's producing it in the first place and why they're doing that. And that's when I finally discovered the missing piece of the puzzle, which formed the basis for my newest book on disinformation that I want to talk to you about today. My key insight here was that the kind of denialism we've been talking about both science and reality, is largely due to disinformation. Not misinformation, but disinformation. Please don't confuse the two. They do it in the media all the time. Lots of folks keep mischaracterizing the problem we face today as one of misinformation, but that leads down the wrong road. If you think that all those people who believe conspiracy theories about vaccines or the 2020 election are just making a mistake, you're never going to get to the bottom of it. People don't suddenly wake up one day and wonder whether there's a Jewish space laser, or whether starting the California wildfires, or whether there are microchips in the COVID vaccines. I mean, nobody just thinks that stuff up. Likewise, the idea that there were 20 suitcases full of Chinese bamboo ballots used to stuff the ballot box in Arizona, that did not just come out of nowhere. Somebody invented that lie, and they did it for a purpose. The kind of denialism we're talking about here isn't a mistake or an accident. It's a lie. So misinformation is a mistake, disinformation is a lie, and remember that for there to be a lie, there has to be a liar. Now, who would lie about whether the COVID vaccines were dangerous, or whether the 2020 presidential election was stolen? And the answer is obvious: somebody who has an interest at stake. If we look at where modern science denial started, it's easy to see that sometimes those interests can be economic. When the big tobacco companies decided to fight the science, which showed that there was a link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, they engaged in a campaign of strategic denialism. If you've read Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, you know about this. Their weapon of choice at this point was public relations, which allowed them to manufacture doubt where there really wasn't any. And here's the thing, it worked. The public became confused. They suddenly thought that the scientific consensus was controversial or open for debate. You remember the phrase, the scientific link between smoking and lung cancer has never been conclusively established. And you know what? They're right. But that's only because the scientific link between any two things has never been conclusively established. It's the problem of induction. I guess all these tobacco executives read their David Hume, but they didn't read their David Hume. They were doing this to buy time. They wanted delay, which they got for the next 40 years so that they could sell cigarettes. So their mantra was they needed more study. We needed more time. Scientists needed proof. They're never going to get proof. And that was really all they needed. They didn't need to show that cigarette smoking didn't cause lung cancer. They needed to show that it was in doubt. And that's why the book is called Merchants of Doubt. By the way, that's the same blueprint that the fossil fuel executives used years later. So now it's beginning to make some sense, right? Liars lie because it benefits them. The rewards don't always have to be economic. They can also be ideological or political. But the point is that the people who create the lies behind a disinformation campaign do so because they want something. And their route to getting it is to create an army of deniers who were duped by their disinformation, which means that the actual people out there believing it are in some sense victims and maybe deserve our empathy. And that's why we should go out and talk to them face to face. But that's not going to solve the problem, I don't think. Now, who would benefit from a lie about the COVID vaccines? The answer might surprise you. I'm sure everybody has heard about this crazy conspiracy theory that the COVID vaccines have tracking microchips in them. But very few people know where that lie came from. I tracked it down and the results were shocking. In April 2020, now think about that, a month into the pandemic, there was an article in an online publication called the Oriental Review, which said that any future vaccines developed in the West would have tracking microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who held patent 666 on this technology. And at the bottom of the article were little buttons that said share on Facebook, share on Twitter, which many people did because by May 2020, 28% of the American voters thought that there was something to this idea, and it spread from there. This was 5 months before the first vaccines had even appeared from Pfizer and Moderna, and the well had already been poisoned because it was disinformation and somebody wanted something. Well, who and what did they want? Well, what the article didn't say is that the Oriental Review is one of 4 English language propaganda arms of Russian intelligence, which they use to pump out disinformation to destabilize the West. Why do they do that? Various reasons. Of course, there's an ideological motive, because while we're arguing amongst ourselves and dying from COVID, we have much less time to pay attention to other things that Russia is up to, like getting ready to invade Ukraine. Russia has troll farms where they push this kind of stuff out all the time as a form of information warfare. But in this case, there was another interest, which was economic. Russia had the Sputnik 5 vaccine in development, and they wanted it to be the one that led the world's fight against COVID. The market for such a vaccine in Africa and Asia was immense, and Russia really did have the Sputnik vaccine in the works before the Pfizer and Moderna ones came out. So it was a matter of great Russian pride as well. It's no coincidence that they named their vaccine Sputnik. So they pumped that lie out there to the West in advance. And for years to follow, thousands of people died because they were afraid to take their COVID vaccines. Interesting little tidbit here. They were too effective with that disinformation campaign because thousands of people in Russia also wouldn't take the Sputnik vaccine. So it sort of backfired a little bit. But that's how it's done. That's how disinformation campaigns work. A few years ago, there was an article in the New York Times called Putin's Long War Against American Science. And in it, it recounts the decades-long history of Russia's campaign to undermine Western science, going all the way back to the AIDS crisis. Do you remember the idea from the mid-'80s that AIDS was invented in a Western lab and that AZT was poison intended to kill people in the third world? And that was Russian disinformation too. And in South Africa, 300,000 people died as a result, it's estimated, of that belief in that disinformation campaign. Now, I'm not saying that all disinformation comes from Russia, though they did invent information warfare in the 20s, and they're very good at it. But what I am saying is that all disinformation works in the same way. And these days, in the post-truth era that's been created by the rise of social media, the consequences of this can be devastating. The goal of disinformation is not just to get you to believe a falsehood, but to distrust and even to hate the people on the other side who do not also believe that same falsehood. This is to say that disinformation is meant to be polarizing. It creates a situation where you may only listen to the people on your own team, so you may not even hear or trust the facts coming from the truth tellers on the other side. In this way, disinformation poisons your mind, not just against one truth, but perhaps the entire edifice through which true beliefs are formed and tested. That's why it's so dangerous for science, as a matter of fact. And what happens then? Maybe you become so exhausted with all the competing narratives and fact checking that you become cynical and tempted to give up on the idea of truth altogether. So even if you don't believe the falsehood, you might just decide, this is too hard, I'm going to give up. Maybe there is no truth. Maybe truth can't be known. Maybe you should just listen to the leader of your team, whoever that happens to be. Here's the problem with that. You've been polarized by disinformation, whether you believe it or not. If you believe it, you're polarized. But even if you don't believe it, maybe if you give up, you're polarized. And in some ways, that's bad news, because that's just what an autocratic leader wants. Because if there's no truth, then there's no blame or accountability. And that opens the door to complete control, first of reality and then of the population. Commenting in her 1974 landmark work, commenting in 1974 on her landmark 1951 work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the eminent political philosopher and Holocaust historian Hannah Arendt said it best, quote, "If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It's deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please." End quote. That's a very chilling quotation. In my 2018 book, Post-Truth, I define the notion of post-truth as the political subordination of reality. It's when someone wants something that's at odds with the facts of reality, so they decide to engage in a strategic denialist campaign of disinformation in order to try to build an army of deniers who can then help them get what they want. In the hands of a corporation, that might result in the creation of doubt over a scientific question that interferes with their ability to make profits, just as we saw with the tobacco companies and with the fossil fuel companies. In the hands of autocrats and would-be authoritarians, the post-truth strategy is perhaps even more dangerous, for it can result in undercutting virtually any facts about reality that you want, such as whether the crime rate is going up or down. Did you hear last night in the State of the Union when Biden talked about the murder rate going down and everybody challenged him? That's a factual matter. There's the Uniform Crime Report tracked by the FBI. They track crime statistics and murder, of course, because it's reported. But they're fighting the facts there. And why do they do it? Or fight the claim that Biden was legitimately elected president? Because it serves their interests. It helps them to consolidate the political power that they want, which is some ways even more tempting than the economic interests. That was the hallmark of Donald Trump's presidency. But we see it recapitulated all around the world now, not just in the American Congress, but around the world where democracy is in peril. I'm told that today Trump is meeting with Viktor Orban, who has gutted democracy in Hungary. So how do we fight this? The first step is to realize what we're up against. All those people who died during the pandemic as a result of their refusal to take the vaccine based on their belief in conspiracy theory, those were preventable deaths. They didn't just die, they were killed, not only by COVID, but by disinformation. You heard me say that the 300,000 people died in South Africa. People died as a result of the disinformation about COVID as well. They're the victims of someone else's strategic denialist campaign. Likewise, I want you to consider what happened at the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, and ask yourself why it happened. We all know there was a special interest at stake and that lies were used to further that special interest. Trump didn't want to leave the presidency, so he created a denialist campaign, and he followed the trail that was blazed by 70 years of successful science denial, and he uses disinformation tactics straight out of the Russian playbook. And so he set in place the big lie, which was at the heart of his ideological and political goal to stay in office. It sounds shocking when you say it like that, but it's true. Trump's big lie is not a disagreement over whether an election was stolen, and it isn't a difference of opinion over whether ballot boxes were stuffed. It was a cold-hearted effort to recruit an army of believers for something that Trump knew to be untrue because it served his political interests. So just like what Putin did with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, Trump did with the 2020 election, and will try to do with the 2024 election, I think, as well. Now, people like to dismiss Trump as a buffoon, and in some ways he is, but he is also a near genius level propaganda operative who understood in a feral sense how to manipulate and exploit the existing political divisions in the United States. And he pulled off what is arguably the first nationwide domestic, civil disinformation campaign in the history of the US. And that's why January 6th happened. I think there's a straight line between those tobacco executives who held their meeting with that public relations official at the Plaza Hotel in New York City on December 15th, 1953, all the way straight line up to Trump's mob that stormed the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. It's the public relations strategy. It's the lying strategy, the propaganda strategy. It's why the vaccines became politicized in the USA. Before COVID, anti-vaxx was fairly bipartisan. And I know because I was studying it. You had liberals who didn't like big pharma, and you had conservatives who didn't like big government. And if you counted up the number of folks who thought that the CDC was lying about whether the MMR vaccines caused autism, it was about evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. But after COVID, it became politicized. Why? Because Trump politicized it. And that too is a Russian disinformation tactic. Don't just make something up. Find something where there's already a bit of disagreement and try to widen that crack. So if something is a pre-existing matter of political debate, that's where you'll see the disinformation. It's got a kernel of truth, makes it more believable. Pretty soon you'll have people believing things not because they're looking at the evidence, but because that's what the folks on their team say they should believe, because those are the people that they trust. And the point is really not even about facts anymore. And again, I point you to the State of the Union last night. When you heard some of the catcalling against Biden, they were disputing factual matters. So what's the second step in fighting back against all this? If the first step in winning a disinformation war is to admit that you're in one, what do you do after that? That is why I wrote my book on disinformation. It is a short pocket-sized citizen's guide. It's really a manifesto. It looks like the little red book because I wanted you to be able to put it in your back pocket, carry it with you. You can read the whole thing in about an hour and then leave it in your Uber, leave it on the bus, let somebody else get it. I intended it to be passed hand to hand because we're really at this point all soldiers in this war against truth. And I took myself to be writing a kind of a training manual. It's MIT Press, it's got footnotes in it, but it is a readable book that is unlike anything else that I've ever written because it's an urgent book that I wanted to write in time for the 2024 election and have everybody read it, not just philosophers, though philosophers too, I hope. I don't have time here to go through all the steps. There are 10 steps at the end of the book about what ordinary citizens can do, but let me at least sketch out the conceptual framework. I think there's a pipeline that goes from the creation of disinformation to its amplification to its belief. And I think that the pinch point is amplification. Because how are you going to stop a disinformer from creating disinformation? Is there any law that you could pass in the US Congress? Is there any sanction that would stop Putin from doing it? I don't think so, because his interest is at stake. Likewise, how do you get a believer in disinformation to understand that they're being exploited and duped? Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool somebody than to convince them that they've been fooled. And I know this because I went to a flat earth convention and tried to do this. It is very, very hard, especially in groups, to convince people that they've been taken in. So one of my stock lines at Flat Earth is I would say, oh, you're right that to be skeptical, and that somebody's out there trying to dupe you, you're just mistaken about who's doing it. They didn't like that, but they're skeptical and believe in conspiracy theories. So at least, say it in a cordial way, we at least could have a conversation about it. So those are some things that you can do, but again, it's not equal to the scale of the problem. If we're going to fight disinformation, we can't just talk to the people who have already been taken in. We need to try to keep them from hearing the disinformation. And that's where we clamp down on the amplification of disinformation. That's where we're going to win this. Now, amplification these days can come from many sources. It's well known that Fox News and other partisan networks amplify lies. After the Dominion lawsuit, I don't think I have to even make an argument for that. It was revealed Fox anchors lied about things that they knew were bogus because it served their agenda. Now, I hate to say it, but sometimes disinformation can be spread also by the mainstream media, who often don't even acknowledge that the message that they're spreading is disinformation or even misinformation, or at least they won't call it such. Here, look at the interests of networks like CNN and MSNBC. They're not corrupt in the way that Fox is corrupt, but they're nonetheless driven by some of the same motives. They're all interested in viewer engagement. They all need to make money. They all get their ratings on a minute-by-minute basis. Did you know that? And they all drive a narrative of conflict, failure, and chaos. Because that serves their interest. That will keep you glued to the set where you just can't turn away. Now, there are different ways to be hostile toward the truth. One is to lie, but that's not the only way. There's also confirmation bias and false equivalence and refusing to take sides on a factual matter. And why would anybody do that? It's because if you watch carefully on CNN and MSNBC, you'll see they don't want to be accused of political bias. That's why you see them both siding an issue. That's why you see them having platforming liars. Soledad O'Brien used to be an anchor on CNN. She's not there anymore, largely because she said one of the truest things I've ever heard: stop booking liars on your program. Because as Stuart Stevens said recently in his most recent book, I can't remember the title right now, how do you tell both sides of a lie? I mean, but they keep booking liars because they want to show that they're not biased. That's terrible. You don't have a NASA launch of a rocket and then have a flat earther on the split screen. You don't do that. You shouldn't do that for the 2020 election theft conspiracy theory either, or a whole host of other lies. CNN ran a live one-on-one town hall meeting in New Hampshire in front of an audience packed with Trump supporters last year, and they give a textbook example of how not to fight disinformation. Soledad O'Brien was right. Don't give a platform to liars. And of course, we all know that the internet, social media, is a great way to amplify lies. Facebook, Twitter, what are they doing? Not much, I'm afraid. On occasion, some of the social media companies have taken a stand on content moderation and tried to provide more accurate information on topics like the pandemic and the 2020 presidential election by tweaking their algorithms that are more geared toward engagement than truth. And they can do this. Their algorithms are black boxes. They know what's in them. We don't. But it is possible for them to do that. And they did so right before the 2020 election. There was that brief shining moment when you would get a little box when you clicked on some conspiracy theory about the election or about COVID. And, they would say, this claim is disputed and give you more information. They don't do that anymore. I'm not sure that we know, since Elon Musk's takeover, whether Twitter is even doing any content moderation these days. One suspects not. They have something now called community notes, which is just another opportunity for the disinformers to crowd in. The false choice between standing up for truth and tolerating disinformation in the name of free speech really seems to have won the day for Elon Musk. And he's out there with a lot of apologists making it sound as if refusing to amplify a liar's message is tantamount to censorship. Now, I ask you, if you were a hardcore free speech First Amendment advocate, so that you thought that even the Ku Klux Klan deserved a parade permit, and you hate their message, but you've got to give them the permit to have their rally. Does that require you to go to the rally and help them hand out their literature? It does not. But that is exactly what Facebook and Twitter are doing. They are amplifying hate speech and lies. They are not required to do that. Refusing to do that is not censorship. Over at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg loves to tout the number of fake messages and fake accounts that they've taken down, as if that's proof of how hard they're fighting disinformation, but they're not doing nearly enough. Trumpeting the number of inauthentic accounts is just playing whack-a-mole. Jack Teixeira, that young Air Force guy who was just in the news so long ago, he's back in the news now because he's pleading guilty to sharing classified information over a gaming platform, I guess it was. One of the things that was leaked is a brag by the Russian military that only 1% of their disinformation on Facebook was being caught by Facebook. Now think about that for a minute. What really needs to happen, I think, is that Facebook and Twitter need to tweak their algorithms. And as I said, the problem is that right now, no one outside the social media giants really knows what's in them. We suspect that they're set for engagement, which sounds benign maybe, except that that's the Trojan horse through which disinformation travels. Now, Mark Zuckerberg dissents. He says he once said it was crazy to think that Russian disinformation on Facebook had any effect on the outcome of the 2016 election. He later admitted that 126 million Americans saw those posts. Kathleen Hall Jamieson has a book out in which she argued that disinformation swung the 2016 election. There's great evidence that they tried again in 2020 and that they're trying again now in 2024. Note too that the problem here isn't one of simple amplification. Social media doesn't just allow you to amplify your message, but to prune your message. And that's dangerous for the following reason. According to Major Jessica Dawson, who's the Information Warfare Team Division Chief at the Army Cyber Institute at West Point, the technology of microtargeting allows you to sell denial and hate just as readily as you would cosmetics and sneakers. So you all know what microtargeting is, right? This is the Facebook tool that the marketers use to look at the demographics and figure out just who they want their ads to go to. They say that after 20 clicks, they know you better than your spouse. And so they know just exactly who to sell that message to. At some level, there's really a fine line between marketing and information warfare. And you find those Facebook marketing tools being used to sell things, but you also find it being used by ISIS, and you find it being used by Russian trolls. You find it being used for microtargeting disinformation. Talk about a silo. You won't even see that. It's intended to radicalize exactly the audience that they know they want to go for. So, might we push for more government regulation of social media companies? I'm sorry, that seems unlikely to happen. There was a 2021 hearing in which testimony was given by experts on disinformation, and both Democrats and Republicans in Congress seemed reluctant to do anything, even after hair on fire testimony by one of my BU colleagues, Joe Donovan, who said that disinformation was basically an existential problem. To do nothing was to see democracy's demise. She said it more eloquently than that. Afterward, Chris Coons, who's a Democrat, said, well, we're not looking to regulate anybody right now. They dismantled Biden's Disinformation Governance Board 2 weeks after it was founded because of a disinformation campaign. The government is not coming to save us on this, and neither is the US Supreme Court. They had a chance in Google versus Gonzalez and Twitter versus Tamna. They did nothing to help, and it doesn't look like they're positioned to do more now. Part of the reason for such inaction, I think, is ironically the disinformation that's being pushed out these days about disinformation. So this is the thing now. There's disinformation about disinformation. If you watch Jim Jordan's weaponization of government subcommittee in the US House of Representatives, What he's been doing is calling disinformation researchers on the carpet and yelling at them to say that they're censors and that they're in cahoots with the Biden administration to censor, to silence conservative voices. And they're arguing in favor, Jim Jordan and the like, in favor of free speech. But again, free speech is something that makes everybody feel like, oh, yes, that's an important thing. And it is. And censorship is a bad thing. And it is. But here's the thing. Remember what I said before. Amplifying somebody's disinformation is bad. Refusing to amplify it is not censorship. It's not interfering with their free speech. Not to mention the fact that the First Amendment guarantees you that you won't be censored by the government. It doesn't say anything about private companies like Facebook and Twitter, which under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act are allowed to take down anything that they want for any reason that they want. So this free speech argument, I think, is a red herring. And in the mouth of Elon Musk and people like him, they make it sound like, oh, but that's how we're going to beat disinformation. That's disingenuous. You don't beat disinformation by having a free-for-all in which you give everybody, an ability, a microphone. Truth does not rise to the top. Imagine if physics let anybody publish, even the flat earthers. Would that help truth come forward? I don't think it would. I think there have to be some gatekeeping around empirical questions. You don't just let anybody with a microphone say anything that they want. In 2019, and here's the shocking thing, doesn't take that many amplifiers to do serious damage. In a 2019 study, the Center for Countering Digital Hate found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. I mean, how do you fight that? Well, you could deplatform those 12, but that was apparently not done. And you can't blame that on Elon Musk, because I checked the night before he took over Twitter, and 8 of those people were still there. So what can the ordinary citizen do? We might try to get our politicians' attention through better outreach about smarter regulation. Perhaps we don't want the US Congress to be the fact checker in chief, because imagine if the leadership in Congress changed, if the political party changed. That's what's happened in Turkey. That's what's happened in Hungary and Russia. They've got laws against fake news in Turkey and Russia. You can go to prison for 10 years. Here's the problem. The government decides what's fake news and what isn't. So that is a dangerous thing, and we have to be careful of that. I think that one solution that we might look into is not government regulation of that type, but government regulation dictating transparency. My colleague at University of Bristol, Stephen Lewandowski, came up with a great idea. Why not mandate that these algorithms that are doing so much damage are open to a group of outside experts who you can shield all the user data, protect privacy of the users all you want, but have some people other than senior engineers at Facebook and Twitter looking at these, so that we don't have to wait for a whistleblower to know that there's damage. We might also use grassroots tactics to demand that our news sources do a better job. A few hundred letters to not only the MSNBC or CNN, but to their advertisers might do wonders on that. And I think that we really have to get moving on all this, because, as you know, this is the scary part where I talk about ChatGPT and AI and how much easier this is all going to become. Because as those ramp up, disinformation gets easier and easier to create, which means that it's more prevalent. The Russians don't need a troll farm, they need a troll garden. They need one SVR officer with ChatGPT to figure this out. And we know where that road leads. So I think that we have to fight this, and we can't let other people do it on our behalf. I think that the point of my book is that we all need to get out there and begin to row in the same direction. And the stakes are this. I think that we have seen, if you look out in the world, that disinformation doesn't just come from foreign governments. there are domestic producers of disinformation. But one insidious thing that you see right now is that foreign governments will tailor their disinformation so that it's attractive to a domestic news filter, like Fox News. Why do you think that propaganda from RT ends up on Fox News? It's because they tailor it so that it will end up, and then usually sometimes it's broadcast back to Russia from Fox News. There is that, but why do they bother with that? Because once disinformation goes through a domestic news filter, our disinformation fighters in the government and in counterintelligence cannot touch it because of our Constitution. They're allowed to fight foreign disinformation, not domestic. So the danger here, and then I'm going to stop, is authoritarianism. It's not just that we're going to lose science, it's that we're going to lose democracy. And you don't have to look that far. Look at Orban's Turkey. Look at look at Orban's Hungary. Look at Erdogan's Turkey. Look at what's happening in Russia. Look at what might happen in the United States if Trump wins another term. He's already said what he would do. And it looks very much like what's happened to other democracies in the world that are no longer democracies, but sham democracies. They still have voting, but they're really electoral dictatorships. I've got some other scary stuff I could say here about George Orwell, but I'm more interested in what you have to say to me by way of questions and answers. I'll just want to leave time for that. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now open the floor to questions. I can also monitor the chat if that's easier for somebody.
Okay.
I'd like to make a comment about free speech.
Okay.
I think free speech is best thought of, and I'm really pretty much of an absolutist on it, but freedom of speech is freedom of expression. It's the right to believe what you believe and to say what you believe. If you're saying things that you don't actually believe, if you're lying or just bullshitting in Harry Frankfurt's sense, if you're just saying what serves your purposes without regard to truth, that's a whole other thing. And I don't think free speech really protects that. It's complicated because it's hard to prove that somebody is lying. But I think that's the crucial distinction between misinformation and disinformation.
Wow.
And my view is that disinformation is not protected by the First Amendment or by norms of freedom.
Wow. Have you written about this? Because are you a philosopher, a lawyer, or both?
I'm a psychologist who works a lot in civil liberties.
You should write about this. You should write about this because I've been studying this for a long time. I've never heard that. And that's a very interesting idea because I mean, you're right. Why is free speech valuable? Why do we value it? It's because if people think that things are true, we want to have a dialogue. We want to have a discussion, an argument. And if somebody's wrong and they're of good faith, maybe they'll change their mind. But if people are using the First Amendment as a fig leaf for a disinformation campaign, you're right. They don't actually believe what they're saying. And now I want to pull out my pocket constitution that I unfortunately don't have in my pocket and figure and see just exactly what it says. But I love that idea because it's not just saying it, it's saying something that you believe to be true. I like that very much. Please write about that so that I can footnote you, okay?
I have written about it, and I'll send you some things.
Send me something through email, and I will work that in the future. Thank you. Well, one of the best questions I've ever gotten. Thank you.
But if we go down that line, don't we have to distinguish between lies and fiction? I mean, First Amendment
Another good one, yeah.
protects fiction, right?
Well, but fiction is not a lie because it's known to be fiction. The distinction I would make is somebody saying what they believe or telling a story that's known to be a story versus saying something that they're presenting as the truth when they in fact know it's false or don't care that it's false. I mean, in libel law, for example, you say
what about the Blair Witch documentary that they presented as a documentary and reality shows on TV that are actually scripted?
You know, it's a really interesting it's a really interesting distinction there, because you remember that book a few years back, A Million Little Pieces? It was just a bestseller, great, memoir. No, it wasn't. It was a lie. But it was still a great book. And a lot of people said, if he just published this as a novel, if he just published it as fiction, he would have had just the same response. Why did he have to pretend that it was true? So, I mean, I like this idea of what is fiction? Fiction is not masquerading as truth. Fiction is known to be a story. I mean, a novel, a book-length work of fiction, people know it's not a lie, that it's a made-up story. But you raise a good thing here, Dale, because you are going to have to limit that distinction pretty carefully. Because even if you're not talking about, because then you've got parody, and then you've got cinema verite, and you've got all these other categories, and you've got sarcasm and irony, and whatever it is Jon Stewart is doing these days. I mean, you've got different kinds of, and then there are also scales of, well, what are the scales of belief? There was a wonderful book a few years back called The Folly of Fools, about self-delusion. Who can really say when you believe something, when you don't? I mean, don't get me wrong, the law is built around being able to do that, right? I mean, they don't just say, oh, who could really tell if he intended to pull the trigger? They adjudicate that in court, and it's decided on. So, I mean, they can actually, that might be the standard that we would emulate. But it's a really interesting philosophical question. Thank you. Thanks for that too.
So I've got a question.
Yeah.
So the examples you gave, mostly focus on outright hostility to science and science denialism, and of course this comes mostly from the political right. I mean, that's where you see most of that, and that's where you see the threat of authoritarianism. And what I'm wondering is how you would distinguish those sorts of cases from sort of misstatements or disinformation that's not necessarily coming from a place of hostility to science.
Mm-hmm.
Where you find more on the political left than the political right. I have in mind things like Justice Sotomayor once claimed that 100,000 children are on ventilators due to COVID, which was just a wild, exaggeration. And another example I have in mind is something like I had my example. What was my other example? I've got when the CDC dropped the COVID guidelines to just 5 days, there were disability activists who accused them of practicing eugenics. That's another example I have in mind. And these are groups that no threat of authoritarianism here, and there's not outright hostility to science. So how would you tell a story about the difference?
Well, the authoritarianism can come from the left. I mean, V.I. Lenin, you can't get much further left than that. And they invented disinformation. I mean, so if anybody thinks that disinformation only comes from the right, that's not true. Now, it has been empirically shown these days, studied by Lewandowski, in fact, that most of the disinformation that we're dealing with does come from the right, but it doesn't have to. So if people on the left get complacent and think, oh, this could never happen to me, no, that it could. But now your underlying question, what do you do about situations in which people exaggerate or make a mistake, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, I guess it depends on why they do it. Look, I think of disinformation as serving strategic denial. That is, it's not just a random lie, it's a lie with a purpose. So Harry Frankfurt talks about, bullshitting as a careless disregard for the truth. That's not what a disinformer has. They care very much about what's true and what you believe, and they want you to believe their falsehood, or if you don't believe it, to at least get, cynical and give up or something like that. But I mean, people should be held accountable when they are careless with the truth. When suppose it's easy to fact check whether it was 100,000 or 10,000, but she kept saying 100,000 even after Sotomayor was told, no, that's wrong, but she kept saying it. Then she needs to be held accountable. But if somebody slips and says, Turkey when they mean Hungary, like I did just a minute ago, that's a mistake, and I immediately corrected it. So that's not disinformation, I hope. It's just it's a mistake.
Yeah.
One thing that I think about is if somebody believes something false and they do it by accident, then wouldn't they be open to correction when shown evidence and change their mind, like a scientist does? And yet, my heart really goes out to the people who were duped by the disinformers about science, about democracy, et cetera, because in some ways they're victimized. I mean, they are responsible for what they believe and what they say if it's false. But there are an awful lot of MAGA people out there who really believe that the election was stolen, even though no evidence is presented to them. And they believe that because they trust Trump. Now, that is not, we could spend all day with informal logic tactics showing why, they're not entitled to those beliefs. And I think we'd be successful. But the thing is, they do genuinely believe it. And so I'm not as hard on them, although they can be very difficult to deal with, as I am the disinformers. Because the cardinal sin here is to say something untrue that you know is untrue, doing it for your own selfish purpose, even though it's hurting someone else. That's the worst possible thing. Sotomayor, others should be held accountable. But I wrote an earlier book called Respecting Truth, in which I talked about there being different levels of disrespect for truth. Lying is the worst. Actually, there's something worse than lying now, which is post-truth, but which is, we can get into that. But there are other ways of disrespecting truth that are not quite outright lying.
And Sotomayor would probably be at the lowest end of this scale, I would expect.
Yes. Mr. Sullivan, I can't see.
Sullivan, yeah, thank you. I have a question as a person on the left about left-wing disinformation. I share the earlier speakers' concerns about it too, even though I'm much more concerned about right-wing disinformation.
Yeah.
I'm thinking in part about disinformation concerning Hamas sexual violence against Israeli Jewish women. But what I'd like to focus on, if this is relevant enough, and if it's not, just let me know, is Boston University and Ibram Kendi. And I'm wondering, in general terms, how you feel about his impact on your university, and then more specifically, Kendi's claim that bringing up an academic achievement gap based on race is itself racist and off limits for discussion. That's my question.
I'm going to get in over my skis here very quickly, because I have to admit that I've never read Ibrahim Kendi. And so I don't know what this controversy is. And so it would be very unwise for me to comment on something. I mean, there are plenty of times where I think I know something and I don't, but this is one where I know that I don't. And I'm not trying to hide here. I really don't know what the controversy.
I understand. You should read How to Be an Anti-Racist.
BU doesn't pay me enough to protect them here. I'm not trying to protect them. I'm just I don't know what I can say. Let me try to say this. In my earlier book, Respecting Truth, I did make the argument on the contemporary topics of the time, where I called out what I thought was left-wing, I didn't call it disinformation at the time or denial, but I guess disrespect for truth, right? Times when, let me put it this way, when political or religious ideology was getting in the way of the pursuit of truth about science. That was the thing that really motivated me to write that book. And so there were certain claims that were being made at the time. And again, I wrote that book more than 2 decades ago, so I'm not going to be able to quote from it skillfully. But I remember that I did write about claims at the time coming from the left that seemed orthogonal to what the scientific consensus was. and I took them to task there. And I still believe that. And I'll say this. Ideology of whatever stripe should not be a part of science. And I know that sounds naive to some people, but when it's a factual matter, whether something is true or false, we can make mistakes. I remember a scientist, I can't remember who it was, at Harvard, a famous biologist, I can't remember his name, said he got caught on one point on something, and he said, well, at least I was on the side of the angels. Oh, no, you don't get to say that, right? You can't say, oh, because I'm from the left, it's okay. No, absolutely not.
Richard Lewontin?
No, he's guilty of something else, I think.
Stephen Jay Gould.
That's who it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because
I
I'm on the
appreciate your
side of the
answer.
angels, he said. I thought, nope, not going to let you get away with that.
But I do want to say you should read Kendi's book.
I will. I'm never going to get caught like that again.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question regarding inoculation.
All right.
It seems we have long-term goals because the current intellectual state of the world is a consequence of our collective failure as educators.
Mm-hmm.
What would we need to do, starting from kindergarten, in order to inoculate people against the misinformation, disinformation?
You've asked such an important question, and I wonder, are you asking about inoculation because you know of my affiliation with CERSI? Is that, or did you just, inoculation's important to you? Because full disclosure, I'm on the board of an organization called the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative, where we are working on this very problem. Remember when I said that you can't debunk your way out of an infodemic? Maybe you can pre-bunk your way out of an infodemic, which means to get there first with the truth. And that's what inoculation theory is about. It goes all the way back to McGuire in the 60s, who talked about the idea that if you can get people to hear the truth first, or to warn them about the disinformation tactics somebody's going to use, that's more effective than debunking. Now, the ideal time to get to people is when they're children. We're in such a state right now, we can't wait for the children to grow up and save us. But you asked a really good question, which is, what can we do? We can start teaching information literacy in kindergarten. Anybody who has ever spent time around kids knows they are so skeptical, and they love debunking, and they love showing that, say, oh, no, you were lying, this was a problem. Not too many years ago in California, there was a teacher named Scott Bedley, fifth grade teacher, who won Teacher of the Year. And he came up with something called the fake news game, where he gave his students a rubric to tell when something was fake news. Did it have a byline? Was it in a publication that you recognize? Had the person ever published anything else? Was the article dated? All these other things, just this rubric, this simple thing that we as adults could use. And the kids loved it so much that they wouldn't go to recess. They would say, no, Mr. Bedley, give us another one, give us another one. So, I mean, kids eat this stuff up. I taught, this is the only crowd in which I can say this without having to explain. I taught the contrapositive and affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent to a group of fifth graders one time. And they went insane. They loved it. They loved the power, the jujitsu of that. So, and in Finland, they do it too. Finland has one of the world's best information literacy curricula. So yes, we need to start with the kids. What do you do if you're already an adult? Here I'm going to give a shout out, again, full disclosure, he's one of my closest friends. Andy Norman has got a book called Mental Immunity. He's the CEO of CERSI, invited me to be on the board. Mental immunity is a concept that's time has come. And it's kind of like when you're on a plane, then they give you that safety briefing, put your own mask on first before you help others around you. if you read Mental Immunity, you can learn, I mean, you already know because of the organization you're in, but you can read about all the informal logic techniques and then teach to others. Now, again, you're the tip of the spear in doing this, but if you weren't aware of Andy's book, Mental Immunity, you might read that. And then somebody asked in the chat how they could get my books, which, you know, bless your heart. Go to LeeMcIntyreBooks.com, and then you can get any of my books, including, dare I confess, 2 novels that I wrote. So talk about, you know, because after writing about truth all day, I wanted to lie. Is it a lie? No, I knew it wasn't. But I wanted to, you know, I wanted to write some fiction. So all my works are on LeeMcIntyreBooks.com, where you can read about them in order and see what my next speaking opportunity is, and click on any link to any program that I've done as well. I gave you too long of an answer there, but
Actually, it should be longer because
I
there's
love
so
that
much.
question.
There's so much to cover.
Yeah,
such
you're right.
as even the way languages are traditionally taught. It's done in a way that is completely disconnected from the ongoing teaching, explicit teaching of good reasoning. So what happens is that we human beings develop a high level of literacy without an accompanying awareness of our biases and of how language can be misused. And we become good misusers of language, and we end up manipulating one another. There's also the big problem of how do we instill the right kind, the intellectual virtues from the children, and onwards.
I love it.
Because without those, the skills end up being misused for whatever personal purpose we have. And so
and it doesn't even have to be about lies, by the way. I mean, propaganda can be true information that you're sharing to try to manipulate somebody. So if you have a manipulative purpose in mind, you can be a propagandist, even if you're saying the things that are true that you believe to be true, but you're saying them for the purpose of manipulating the other person into believing it. It's real. Another thing that you might read along these lines, Qasim Qassam, greatest name ever in history, Cassam is his last name. He's a philosopher, forget which school, I think it's Warwick in England. He's got a book on intellectual vices. I think it's called Vice Epistemology. I can't remember the name of the book. It's a brilliant book, and you might take a look at that too, because it talks about the values of belief. That it's not just a matter of fact checking, it's a matter of, goes back to Aristotle, doesn't it? Being the right kind of person. If you're the right kind of person with the right kind of intellectual values, then you will believe true things. It's not like you can logic chop it up. It's that you have to have this attitude of consistency, coherence, reason.
We have to
care. Exactly right. Read Qasim Qassam on this. Really fascinating stuff. Virtue epistemology, I'm sure you all know about. He writes about vice epistemology. Really sexy stuff.
Thank you.
Well, and with that, I am afraid I will have to call this to a close. I wish we could go for another few hours. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's been fantastic. And I do hope to have this on our YouTube channel later today, certainly by early next week. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. I wish I could be there in person. These are some of the best questions I've ever gotten. Thank you all.
Thanks very
much.
Thank
you, Donna. Thank you, Lee.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.